The snow outside the camp was untouched. No footprints, no tracks, no indication that 6 adult human beings had crossed that surface in any direction. The gas stove was off, not because it had run out of fuel, but because someone had manually closed the valve with precision before going nowhere. The sleeping bags were open. The equipment was powered on. The tents were fully set up. The personal belongings of 6 experienced researchers sat undisturbed, exactly where each of them had left them. And 43 times, in the 2 hours before all of this, something the system could not identify had attempted to establish contact with the team's communication equipment. 43 times. No one on the team reported it during the last call. The leader's voice was steady. He said everyone was fine. He ended the transmission. After that, total silence. No distress signal. No activation of personal locators. No tracks in the snow. No bodies. No explanation within any protocol, any logic, or anything anyone has managed to formulate in the 7 years since that night in the Andes. 6 people, gone in the span between one scheduled check-in and the next. There is no answer, but there are details, and each detail is worse than the last. If you just heard what I described and thought there had to be a simple explanation, stop. There isn't one. And the deeper you go into this story, the harder it becomes to find any rational way out of what happened in that stretch of the Andes in September 2017. This channel exists to tell the stories that don't resolve, the ones that remain open not because of a lack of investigation, but because what happened doesn't fit into any category the investigation recognizes. If you're not subscribed yet, do that now and turn on notifications, because the kind of content you'll find here doesn't show up anywhere else. Like this video too. And before we go any further, drop a comment below telling me which city you're watching from. I want to know where the people who can stomach this level of story are coming from. 6 researchers. Professionals with decades of experience in extreme terrain. Equipment functioning. Active communication. A route planned with surgical precision. Everything a serious expedition needs, this one had. And still, on a sub-freezing night deep in the Argentine Andes, the 6 of them were simply no longer there. No signal, no trail, no explanation that any person, in any institution, has managed to sustain for more than a few weeks before rewriting, shelving, or quietly abandoning it. What you're about to see in the next few minutes is the case exactly as it was documented. The equipment data, the rescue team's reports, what local residents knew and never told authorities, and what the expedition photographs captured that should not have been there. Each layer you uncover makes the silence heavier. The photograph with the shadow that had no origin was taken at 3:47 p.m. on September 21, 2017. 6 hours and 53 minutes later, Rafael Andrade made his final contact with the support team in Salta. His voice was steady, the team was stable, everything normal. After that, nothing. The photograph existed, the shadow existed, and no one on the team had said a word about it during that last call. This is the point where everything stops making sense, and it will continue not making sense. The expedition had been planned over the course of 4 months. It wasn't improvised, it wasn't an adventure for thrill seekers, it wasn't the kind of undertaking unprepared people attempt at extreme altitude. It was a structured scientific operation with a clear objective: to map glacial variations in a specific stretch of the Andes between 9,800 and 13,800 feet above sea level, an area poorly documented, difficult to access, and largely absent from previous expedition records. The funding was secured. The protocol was established. The people chosen to carry out the work were exactly the right people to do it. Rafael Andrade was 43 years old with 15 years of accumulated mountain field experience. He was the kind of professional who didn't make planning mistakes, not out of overconfidence, but because expedition after expedition had taught him that mountains don't negotiate with carelessness. Alongside him was Camila Vasquez, a glaciologist with 3 prior expeditions in the Chilean Andes and 17 published scientific papers. Diego Pereira, a meteorologist who had spent 2 full winters in isolated research stations in Patagonia. Tomas Ruiz, a satellite communications technician with experience in scientific expeditions and military field operations. Luciana Ferreira, a physician specializing in high-altitude emergency medicine. Marcos Ibanez, a scientific photographer and documentarian whose work had been published on 4 continents. 6 people, 6 profiles that together covered every possible risk variable in extreme terrain. The communication protocol was simple and rigid: mandatory contact every 12 hours, with a 30-minute tolerance window. Any silence beyond that limit would trigger an immediate alert protocol. It was a system designed not to fail, so that no matter what happened in the field, the support team in Salta would always know where the expedition was and in what condition. The system didn't fail. The people disappeared. Before departure, the planning team consulted residents of villages near the section that would be studied, a standard procedure to gather information about local terrain behavior and seasonal weather conditions. The residents were not receptive. They weren't hostile, but in more than one conversation they repeated that that specific stretch of the mountain range was not an area for prolonged camping. When pressed for a reason, they offered no technical justification. They only said that that part of the mountain did not behave like the rest. No one recorded those warnings as relevant data. They were classified as local superstition and dismissed. The team departed from Salta on September 18, 2017, at 6 a.m. Favorable weather, full visibility, stable temperatures. The first 3 days followed protocol exactly. Contacts were made at the scheduled times. Rafael handled each call with precision, confirming position by coordinates, reporting weather conditions, describing the physical state of each team member. No incidents, no route deviation, nothing indicating any kind of problem. On the afternoon of the second day, Marcos Ibanez transmitted via satellite a set of photographs of the stretch they were crossing. The images showed the extent of the glacier they were mapping, a mass of ice descending the slope with a geometry that some members of the support research team, weeks later, would describe as strange, not natural, as if it had been shaped by something other than erosion. At the time, no one paid attention to that. The photographs were archived as routine documentation. On the third day, the expedition reached the definitive campsite, a natural rock platform that appeared, in satellite imagery, to be the ideal location. Protection from crosswinds, solid ground, strategic positioning for mapping the upper band. What the satellite images did not convey was the silence of that place. Rafael Andrade mentioned it during the evening contact on the third day, the last contact, not as something disturbing, as scientific data. He described that the wind that had accompanied the expedition for the previous 2 days had completely ceased as soon as they entered that stretch, that there was no sound of wildlife, no birds, no insects, none of the small animal noise typically present at that altitude, that the silence had a different quality than ordinary mountain silence. Camila Vasquez had suggested the hypothesis of an acoustic pocket caused by the geographic formation of the area. Rafael recorded it as an interesting observation, confirmed everyone was fine, ended the call. What Rafael did not mention, what none of the 6 mentioned during that call, was that 2 hours earlier, Tomas Ruiz's communication equipment had begun logging something neither of them could explain. The system's automatic log was capturing repeated attempts to receive a signal from a source the equipment could not identify. It was not atmospheric interference. It was not frequency noise. It was a structured attempt at contact, origin unknown, repeated at regular intervals, 43 times in 90 minutes. Tomas Ruiz was the best satellite communications technician available for that expedition. If anyone could identify the origin of that signal, it was him, and he didn't. Not because he didn't try, but because the origin did not exist within any parameter his equipment was capable of recognizing. Neither of them said anything about it during Rafael's call with the support team. 12 hours later, the alert protocol was activated. The silence had begun, and along with the silence, Marcos Ibanez's photograph waited on a memory card inside an intact tent, with a shadow in the upper right corner of the frame that had no origin in any light source, any structure, or anything visible in that terrain. Something was at that campsite before the disappearance, and in the next chapter, you'll find out exactly what the rescue team found when they arrived, and why the official report about that scene was rewritten 3 times before being archived without an answer. Sergeant Eduardo Calleja used the word intact 11 times in his initial report. 11 times in the same document. It wasn't careless repetition. It was the only word that fit. The only word that accurately described what he and the other 7 gendarmes found when they reached the campsite. after 46 hours of travel across extreme high-altitude terrain. Intact, as if the 6 people had simply ceased to exist without disturbing absolutely anything around them. That is not what happens when people die in the mountains. It is not what happens when people flee the mountains. It is not what happens in any scenario that any extreme terrain rescue protocol had prepared that team to encounter. The rescue unit consisted of 8 experienced members of Argentina's National Gendarmerie and 2 civilian guides familiar with that section of the range. They departed equipped for the worst scenario they could imagine: hypothermia, fractures, altitude collapse, avalanche. They carried medical supplies, ropes, snow rescue tools. They were prepared to find people in critical condition or to recover bodies. They found neither. All 6 tents were pitched and properly secured to the ground. The tension lines were in place. No structure had been knocked down by wind, none had been damaged. The campsite layout was exactly what you would expect from an expedition that was functioning, not one whose members had completely disappeared the night before. Inside the tents, the sleeping bags were open. Not folded, not packed, open, in the exact position they would be if someone had just climbed out of them. In 2 tents, there were clothes laid out on top of the bags, positioned the way someone would leave them after getting up in the middle of the night to step outside briefly. Nothing was overturned. Nothing was broken. There was no sign of abrupt movement, no disturbance suggesting haste, panic, or struggle. 6 people walked out of those tents without disturbing anything. The scientific equipment sat on the portable tables where it had been set up. Camila Vasquez's and Diego Pereira's laptops were open. The batteries had drained at some point after the disappearance, but the devices had not been closed. Someone had left those screens open without intending to return and shut them, or without having time to think about it. Tomas Ruiz's communication equipment was assembled, powered on, and functioning. There was no technical malfunction. The system operated within normal parameters. There was simply no one there to operate it, and the automatic log recording the 43 attempted contacts from an unidentified source in the hours before the disappearance remained stored in the system's memory, waiting to be found. Marcos Ibanez's camera rested atop his photography gear inside his tent, memory card still inside the device. The last images had been taken on the afternoon of the 3rd day, hours before the final contact. No photographs after that time. No record of the moment when something changed. The camera of a documentarian trained to record everything remained still and untouched while something happened just yards away. And then there was the stove. The gas stove was off. The valve had been manually closed correctly. The propane tank was more than 60% full. The fuel had not run out. There was no technical reason for the stove to be off. Someone had turned it off intentionally, consciously, with the presence of mind required to perform a precise, everyday action. That action implies that whoever performed it was thinking clearly at that moment. Seconds later, that person was nowhere. Sergeant Calleja returned to the stove 3 times during the campsite inspection. His colleagues later reported that he would stand in front of it for long stretches without speaking, without writing anything in the notebook he carried, as if that tank with 60% fuel and that precisely closed valve were the exact point where the logic of what he was seeing collapsed entirely. The team swept a 2-mile radius around the campsite, 2 miles in every direction, at altitude, with fresh snow partially covering the ground in multiple bands. Snow had fallen the previous night, according to meteorological records, which meant that any movement after that point would have left visible marks on the surface. The snow was untouched in every direction. No footprints, no drag marks, no surface disturbance indicating human passage leaving the campsite perimeter in any direction. 6 people did not cross that snow. Whatever happened to them happened without any of them taking a single step beyond where they had set up camp. The initial report by the Gendarmeria Nacional, dated September 26, 2017, used the word inexplicable to describe the scene. The document was withdrawn 2 days later and replaced with a second version that changed inexplicable to inconclusive. That second version was also withdrawn. The third, the one that remains in the official files today, describes the situation as a disappearance under undetermined circumstances, pending further investigation. 3 versions. 3 attempts to find a word that could contain what that scene was. None of the 3 succeeded. The follow-up investigation never produced results. The bodies were never found. No object belonging to the expedition was located outside the campsite perimeter. No resident of the nearby villages reported seeing or hearing anything on the night of September 21 into September 22. When the last gendarme left that section of the mountain range, the place returned to what it had been: rock, ice, and the same silence Rafael Andrade had described hours before disappearing as an interesting geographic characteristic. The campsite was dismantled. The belongings were collected and returned to the families, and the 43 attempted contacts from an unknown source recorded on Tomas Ruiz's equipment were placed inside a technical report that no official institution has publicly commented on to this day. In the next chapter, you'll learn about each of the 6 researchers in detail, what each of them left behind, what they said in the days before the expedition, and what those conversations have in common, a connection no one made until there was nothing left to do. There is one detail that connects all 6 researchers in the weeks before the expedition. It's not a detail that appeared in the official reports. It's not something any institution formally connected. It's a pattern that only becomes visible when you place the accounts side by side, and when you do, what emerges is not coincidence. It's something that has no name, but that was present in each of them before they entered that mountain. Each of the 6 said something to someone close to them in the days before departure that didn't fit within the normal optimism of people about to carry out a well-planned job. They weren't expressions of fear. They were expressions of something none of them could name. And none of them knew the other 5 were saying the same thing. Rafael Andrade was 43 years old with 15 years of mountain field experience. He was the expedition leader not by title, but by accumulated competence, the kind of professional other experienced professionals trust without hesitation. 3 weeks before departure, he called his older brother Carlos and said there was something about that section of the range that didn't show up in the data. Carlos asked him to clarify. Rafael changed the subject. He didn't return to it. Carlos interpreted it as pre-expedition stress and didn't press further. He only stopped interpreting it that way when the rescue team reached the campsite and found nothing. Camila Vasquez was 38 and considered one of the most competent glaciologists of her generation in Argentina. Methodical, precise, the kind of person who documented absolutely everything. Colleagues reported that in the week before the expedition she arrived to lectures quieter than usual. Not disturbed, quiet, as if she were processing something that didn't yet have a defined enough shape to be spoken aloud. On the day she left for Salta, Camila left a notebook on her office desk, containing notes about the section they would map. Most of the notes were technical, but on the last page, written in handwriting different from the rest, more pressed into the paper, more irregular, as if written under a different kind of tension, there was a sentence no one has been able to contextualize within the notebook's content. 5 words. The geometry doesn't close. No one knows which geometry Camila was referring to. The notebook remains in the family's archives. The sentence remains without context. Diego Pereira was 41, a father of 2, and possessed a tolerance for isolation and adversity his colleagues described as impermeable. He didn't complain, didn't dramatize, didn't assign emotional weight to objectively difficult conditions. Exactly the kind of person you want on an expedition in extreme terrain, someone who processes the environment as data, not as threat. In the week before departure, Diego sent an email to the Institute's coordinator flagging an inconsistency in the meteorological data for the section they would study. Atmospheric pressure readings showed variations he described as statistically anomalous, behavior inverse to what would be expected for that altitude and time of year. He requested access to older records for comparison. The coordinator replied that the available records were already in the system. Diego did not pursue the matter. He departed without filing any formal objection, but he brought the notebook where he had written down each anomalous reading and continued recording them in the field, page after page, until the moment he stopped writing anything at all. Tomas Ruiz was 35 and had worked in communications and equipment operations for 12 years. He had maintained active communication in conflict zones, natural disaster regions, and terrains where most systems fail due to atmospheric conditions or physical damage. If anyone on that expedition knew exactly what was recorded in the satellite equipment log, the 43 attempted contacts from an unknown source in the 2 hours before Rafael's final call, it was Thomas. He knew what that log meant, and he chose not to mention it during the last check-in, or didn't have time, Or there was a third reason no one can formulate because Thomas is no longer here to explain. The silence of a specialist in the face of an anomaly he was uniquely capable of fully understanding is, by itself, one of the heaviest parts of this entire story. Luciana Ferreira was 32 and the youngest member of the team. A physician specialized in high-altitude medicine, strong presence, someone whose words carried weight when spoken. On the night before departing for Salta, she called her mother. They spoke for 40 minutes. At the end, Luciana said this expedition was different from the others. Her mother asked if she was afraid. Luciana said it wasn't fear. She said it was something else, but she couldn't name it. She hung up saying she would call when she returned. She never did. Marcos Ibanez was 39 and had documented scientific expeditions on 4 continents. He was a trained observer in the most literal sense of the word, someone who had spent decades calibrating his eye to capture what exists at the edge of the visible. And that is exactly what he did on the afternoon of the 3rd day, at 3:47 p.m., when he pointed his camera at a specific point in the terrain and pressed the shutter 4 consecutive times. The 4 photographs were analyzed by 2 independent imaging specialists with no prior knowledge of the case. Both reached the same conclusion. The shadow in the upper right corner of the frame was not digital manipulation, not a lens artifact, not a surface reflection. It was a shadow produced by something present in the camera's field of view at the moment of capture, something blocking enough light to cast that shadow at that specific angle, yet not appearing in the image. The sun was in the wrong position to produce that projection. There was no rock, no structure, nothing visible in the terrain capable of causing it. Marcos Ibanez photographed the absence of something that was there. 4 times, in sequence. As if he knew he needed to document it before the opportunity disappeared. 6 hours and 53 minutes later, he and the other 5 were gone from the same place where that shadow appeared. In the next chapter, you'll learn what residents of nearby villages knew about that specific stretch of the range and refused to tell authorities. People who never knew each other, in communities separated by dozens of miles, describing the same thing in different words. What they describe has no name, but it follows a pattern that stretches across decades, and the 2017 expedition was not the first to encounter it. Piedra Negra doesn't appear on most publicly circulated maps. It lies 26 miles from the point where the campsite was found, has no paved road access, fewer than 200 residents, and is the kind of place the government visits occasionally and the media never visits at all. Which also makes it the kind of place where people say what they know without the filter public exposure imposes. When Argentina's National Gendarmerie conducted its first interviews with residents of the region after the disappearance, Piedra Negra was on the list. The official records described the responses as non-contributory, technical language for no one said anything we consider relevant. What the records do not describe is what was said and not written down. That surfaced later through an independent journalist from Salta named Hector Mamani, who spent 3 months visiting communities in the region and recording conversations authorities had never documented. The blog where Mamani published this material is no longer online, but the content was preserved and circulated among independent researchers following the case. What he found in Piedra Negra, in San Isidro de las Piedras, and in Alto Condor has no technical explanation. But it has consistency. And that consistency, between people who never knew one another, in communities separated by dozens of miles, describing the same thing in different words, makes it impossible to dismiss. The first account came from a man identified only as Demetrio, 74 years old, born in Piedra Negra, never lived anywhere else. Demetrio said that stretch of the range where the expedition disappeared was known among the village elders by a Quechua expression Mamani transliterated as Donde el aire se dobla, where the air bends. It wasn't an official designation, it was a description. An attempt to name something ordinary language had no category to contain. Demetrio explained that the elders used the expression to indicate areas where the environment did not follow the rules of the rest of the mountain, where the wind stopped for no reason, where animals would not enter, where people who ventured beyond certain points came back different, or did not come back at all. Mamani asked Demetrio to clarify what he meant by came back different. The man remained silent long enough for the silence itself to become part of the answer. Then he said some returned unable to describe what had happened, not because of trauma, not because of confusion, but because there was genuinely nothing to describe, as if the time they had spent in that stretch simply did not exist in memory, not as forgetting, as absence, as though time in that specific point of the range did not function the same way it did everywhere else in the world. Demetrio was 8 years old when 3 shepherds disappeared in that same area in the mid-1950s. The 3 left with their flock and never returned. The flock came back on its own 2 days later. The animals arrived in the village without injuries, without visible signs of physical stress, in absolute silence. Sheep are not silent animals. They arrived mute and remained that way for days. Demetrio said he remembered those animals because there was something in their eyes that was not the look of something frightened. It was something else, an absence, as if something that should have been inside them was no longer there. At 8 years old, he couldn't name it. At 74, he still couldn't. The 3 shepherds were never found. In San Isidro de las Piedras, Mamani interviewed a 56-year-old woman named Rosa, who had worked as a trail guide in the region for nearly 2 decades before abruptly stopping in 2009. Rosa stopped because she had led a group of tourists near the same section in question, and at a certain point on the route, every member of the group, herself included, simultaneously experienced something she spent several minutes trying to describe before finding the right words. She said it was like looking at something your eyes register but your brain refuses to process, as if the visual information were arriving normally, but its meaning were not being produced, as if that point in the terrain existed outside the reach of anything the human mind can convert into comprehension. The group turned back without discussion. No one spoke during the entire descent. When they reached the trailhead, Rosa tried to bring up the episode with 2 of the tourists. Both seemed to have no memory of the moment when the group had stopped. They remembered the trail, the landscape, the moments before and after, but not that specific point, as if that interval of time had been removed from the sequence without leaving a visible gap. Rosa never returned to that area, never accepted groups for that route again, and when Mamani asked why, she did not answer with fear. She answered with something more precise than fear. She said there were places where human presence simply was not processed by the environment, where existing produced no effect, and that stretch of the range was one of those places. In Alto Condor, the most unsettling account came from a man Mamani identified only by the initials JC, at the interviewee's request. 48 years old. He had worked as a porter on scientific expeditions in the region throughout the 1990s and early 2000s. He participated in at least 4 expeditions that passed through areas adjacent to the stretch, where the 2017 team disappeared. On 2 of those occasions, scientific groups requested to approach that specific section. Both times, the advance was halted. Not by a physical obstacle, not by weather conditions, by a resistance JC described as if the terrain did not want to be crossed, as if each step in that direction cost more than the one before, not in physical exertion, but in something he could not locate in the body, something that was not fatigue and not fear and had no name in any language he knew. On both occasions, the groups retreated without discussion, and both times, what was strangest was not the sensation itself, it was the silence afterward. No one talked about what had happened, as if there were a tacit agreement not to name it, as if naming it would make it more real than anyone was willing to sustain. When Mamani asked JC what he believed had happened to the 2017 team, the man stared at a fixed point for far too long to be comfortable. Then he said only that that stretch of the range was not a place where things happened to people. It was a place where people stopped happening. In the next chapter, you'll learn what the expedition's own equipment recorded, the files recovered from the abandoned devices at the campsite, the data no official institution has publicly commented on, and what Marcos Ibanez's photographs revealed when analyzed by specialists who had no idea what they were looking for. Because there is something in the numbers and in the images that no conventional explanation can absorb, and it remains unanswered to this day. The equipment was collected from the campsite in October 2017 and sent to the technical department of the university responsible for the expedition. Laptops, measurement instruments, climate recording devices, Tomas Ruiz's communication system, everything cataloged, sealed, analyzed. The report produced from that analysis was classified for internal use and never made publicly available. What is known about the contents of that report comes from 2 sources. The first was a researcher within the technical department who, under complete anonymity, gave an interview to Hector Mamani 2 years after the disappearance. The second was a group of independent researchers who obtained partial access to the digital files through a lawsuit filed by the families. Partial access, because a significant portion of the files had been corrupted in a way university technicians describe using a word they did not expect to need in a technical assessment. Inexplicable. The corruption had not been caused by physical damage. The equipment was in perfect condition when collected. There was no impact, no excessive moisture, no technical reason the files should not exist, and yet they did not. Entire blocks of time in the records where the instruments were active, operating within normal parameters, recording, but where no data had been captured. There was no system error, no hardware failure. There was pure absence. Intervals of time the equipment passed through without registering anything, as if that period had simply not occurred within the sensor's range. The technical team attempted forensic digital recovery. The result was the same. There was nothing to recover because nothing had been recorded. The gaps in the logs began approximately 3 hours before Rafael Andrade's final contact with the support team and extended until the moment the devices were powered down by the rescue unit. 3 hours before the last call, something simultaneously interfered with the recording process of every device. Rafael made that call without mentioning any anomaly. Either he had not noticed, or he had noticed and did not have time to process what it meant, or he had noticed, understood, and calculated that mentioning it would change nothing. None of those possibilities leads anywhere that makes sense. The climate data that survived the corruption, the records prior to the blank interval, were analyzed by the independent research group and revealed what Diego Pereira had begun documenting without being able to name. Atmospheric pressure readings in the hours before the disappearance displayed variations the researchers described as physically inconsistent with any known climate pattern for that altitude and time of year. The variations were not dramatic in magnitude. They were wrong in direction. Pressure behaving inversely to what any established model predicted for those specific conditions, as if the environment at that specific point in the range were operating under rules different from those governing the rest of the atmosphere. Diego had written down each of those readings in the notebook he kept alongside the digital logs. Next to every anomalous entry, he placed a question mark. He did not write a hypothesis, did not write an interpretation, did not attempt to explain what the numbers were showing. Just the question mark, repeated with the same pen pressure, in the same position on the page, entry after entry, in the final documented hours of his existence as a field researcher. A man described as impermeable to discomfort, who had spent 2 full winters in isolation in Patagonia without recording a single line of disturbance in his field journals, writing question marks in sequence until the moment he stopped writing anything at all. Now Thomas Ruiz's log. The satellite communication system kept an automatic record of all transmission attempts sent and received. That log partially survived the file corruption, and what it showed was this. In the 2 hours preceding the disappearance, the device registered 43 attempts to receive a signal from a source the system could not identify. They were not transmissions from the support team in Salta. Those had clear identification and scheduled timestamps. They were not atmospheric interference. Interference does not generate structured connection attempts at regular intervals. It was something trying to establish contact with Thomas Ruiz's equipment deliberately, repeatedly, persistently. The system logged the attempt, logged the failure to identify the source, logged the termination, and then, at the next interval, the attempt began again. 43 times, in 90 minutes, at regular intervals between each cycle. Thomas Ruiz was the most experienced satellite communications technician available for that expedition. He had operated identical systems in conflict zones and in extreme terrain rescue operations. He knew every parameter, every possible behavior, every anomaly that system was capable of generating. If anyone could have identified the origin of that signal, it was him. And he didn't, because the origin did not exist within any parameter his equipment was capable of recognizing. Thomas knew what was recorded in that log, and during Rafael's final check-in, he did not say a word. Marcos Ibanez's 4 photographs were the final item analyzed. 2 independent imaging specialists, with no prior knowledge of the case, no access to information about the disappearance, no context beyond the images themselves. Both reached identical conclusions independently, without communication during the analysis process. The shadow in the upper right corner of the frame was not digital manipulation, not a lens artifact, not a surface reflection, not a projection from any visible structure within the image field. It was a shadow produced by something present in the photographed space at the moment of capture. Something blocking enough light to cast that shadow at that specific angle, yet not appearing in the image. It was not outside the frame. It was inside. It simply was not captured by the camera sensor, despite blocking the light that sensor recorded. It was there. It produced a measurable physical effect. And it was invisible. Marcos Ibanez photographed that point 4 consecutive times. A documentarian with decades of experience does not press the shutter 4 times in the same framing by accident. He was recording something, documenting a presence his eyes likely detected in some way the camera could only register indirectly. 6 hours and 53 minutes later, he and the other 5 were gone from the same place. Today, 7 years later, none of the 6 has been found. No object has been located outside the campsite perimeter. No investigation has produced a sustainable explanation. The university files remain classified. Mamani's blog is offline. The residents of Piedra Negra, San Isidro de las Piedras, and Alto Condor still do not cross that section of the range. And the silence Rafael Andrade described in his final call as an interesting geographic characteristic remains exactly where it has always been. The corrupted data exist. The photographs with the shadow without origin exist. The 43 signals from an unknown source exist. The question marks in Diego Pereira's notebook exist. Camila Vasquez's sentence exists. The stove turned off with precision by someone who seconds later was nowhere exists. What does not exist is an explanation for any of it. If this video left you without an exit, it's because there isn't one to give. This story doesn't close because what happened in that stretch of the Andes doesn't fit inside anything any investigation recognizes. Like this video now, not as an automatic gesture, but because you just watched something most people would never have the nerve to face to the end. Subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications, because what's coming in the next videos follows the same level. Stories with no answers, told without softening anything. And leave a comment below telling me which city you're watching from. I want to know where the people who made it this far are coming from.